Yeah, sure. Thanks, Paul. Hi, everybody. So, like Paul said, we're going to talk about the limitations of name matching only. So, really, like, what does that mean? And I think to get a good understanding, because we're basically going to be looking behind the scenes of what's happening at background screening companies out there. So, you really have to have an understanding of a little bit of background. So, let's start with that. So, there's consumer reporting agencies is a term you hear a lot, and it comes into play in our industry. So you'll hear CRA and people are like, what's a CRA? Well, a CRA is a consumer reporting agency, and that's as defined by the FCRA. What's the FCRA? The FCRA is the Fair Credit Reporting Act for our purposes. So the Fair Credit Reporting Act is the federal law that governs what happens with consumer reporting agencies. So this is, a lot of people think of like Experian, TransUnion, Equifax. Those are the three large credit bureaus, and they totally come under play with this. But it's also a little bit of a wrongfully named law, being that it's Fair Credit Reporting Act. Even if a background check just contains criminal information, it still falls under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. So there's a little bit of history. So for years and years, the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, which we're all a lot more familiar with than the CFPB, the Consumer Fraud Protection Bureau. So for years and years, the Federal Trade Commission governed what happened under the Fair Credit Reporting Act and happened with companies like us and what we do for clients like you. So a couple of years ago, the government created the Consumer Fraud Protection Bureau. Well, this also has authority over what happens under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and again, what happens with background screening companies. So there's a lot of terms and a lot of acronyms used here, and people can think, well, that doesn't apply to us because we're not doing credit. But it applies to all background checks that are done by consumer reporting agencies, even if it's not credit information. So hence, all of this comes into play when it comes to background checks. So we're talking about name match only. So what happened in November, the Consumer Fraud Protection Bureau came out with an opinion letter saying that when companies like us, consumer reporting agencies, are doing name matching only, it's wrong. And I'm like, well, of course it's wrong. It's always been wrong to commercial investigations. We don't operate like that. It's like the Consumer Fraud Protection Bureau had to go through all the time and energy to put out this opinion letter. So it obviously is happening in our industry way more than I ever was aware of, or way more than it should be. So what happens at commercial investigations that we're so different? Well, we have access to different data sets and we triangulate data and we use human intervention. But we're getting deep into an issue right now. So let's talk about Michael White, and let's bring this to light by talking about a situation. So I like to refer to Michael White. So Michael White is a person who wants to chaperone his daughter's trip to Disney for her cheer competition because his wife has a conference that week. He's also giving back to his community and being a youth minister before his kids are old enough to be at that age, and they're not going to want him being a youth minister. Then his youngest asked him to coach his Little League team. So within 6 months, Michael White is going to have 3 different background checks done. Now, Michael White is not really one person. There are over 1,000 Michael Whites in the U.S. So that's a name match only, is Michael White. So what happens when there's a background screening company that does a name match only, and you run a multi-jurisdictional database or a criminal record check or a sex offender registry, you're going to see there's a number of Michael Whites that are sex offenders in a number of different states. But how do you know if that's your person? How do you know what your background screening company is doing? How do you know what they use to identify? So this is where it opens up for you as consumers to ask your background screening company, or for you to know what we do here at Commercial Investigations if you're a consumer of us. So a lot of searches are run by names, and we'll get name match only, but there's almost always another piece of identifying information. So we talk about personal identifying information, PII. Very, very similar across all industries. Name, date of birth, social security number, and address. Those are the four main personal identifying information that come into play. So besides name, what other information can we match on? And a lot of times there will be a year of birth or a date of birth or a partial social or a complete social or an address. So we can triangulate our data. So we get the data we can, And then we have a third-party private investigative databases that only private investigative agencies can access, where we triangulate that data. So we can put in a name and see, well, oh my gosh, there's over 1,000 Michael Whites in the US, but let's see how many Michael Whites have ever resided in Schenectady County, New York. Okay, there we go. And of those Michael White, what social security numbers do those Michael White have? And how does that match the social security number or the last 4 digits of the social security number that we have? So we're not doing name match only, but what I'm explaining to you requires human intervention. So it is a little more costly. We are staffed much more heavily than a consumer reporting agency that just automates this whole process and just basically passes through to its consumers something that says this is a name match only. So that's behind the scenes, and that's what's happening at commercial investigation. For other background screening companies, obviously they're doing name matching only, or the Consumer Fraud Protection Bureau never would have came out with this opinion. So that's a little bit of summary, a lot of terms for you. So what questions do you have? What do we want to talk about?